Imagine a nation that's been under the thumb of foreign rulers for nearly 400 years. One can only imagine the kind of scars that this leaves. Today, we're exploring the difficult and transformative history of the Philippines, a country shaped by centuries of colonial rule. We'll explore the fierce battles fought for freedom, the profound hardships endured by its people, and how these long years of struggle have changed the nation's identity and culture. Stick around to learn how these historical chains have influenced the Philippines' present struggles and opportunities. Understanding this past is important to fully understand the challenges and potential that lie ahead for this complicated country. Before the sails of the Spanish galleons appeared on the horizon, the Philippines was a mix of thriving kingdoms and chiefdoms. Leaders known as datus, rajas, sultans, and lakans ruled over these realms. In Luzon, the kingdom of Tondo stood proud, while further south in the Visayas, the Rajanate of Cebu was the center of trade and culture. Over in Mindanao, the Sultanate of Sulu commanded respect and influence over the seas. Each of these societies had their own systems of trade, customs, and political alliance. It was clear the archipelago had a rich mix of cultures. As the 16th century dawned, so did the era of Spanish conquest. In 1565, the Spanish set foot on the islands, marking the beginning of a long and difficult colonial era. The Spaniards were harsh rulers, imposing heavy taxes and snatching land from locals. They forced people to become slaves and made them work long hours doing grueling labor. The Spanish exploited both the resources and people here. They tried to convert the local populations to Christianity too, usually with the blade of a knife, and began relentless military campaigns to stop any resistance. Of course, the locals didn't just sit by and let the brutality happen. No, they fought fiercely, with numerous uprisings flaring across the islands, particularly in Mindanao and the Visayas. These conflicts were a symbol of the Filipino people's indomitable spirit, which would eventually lead to huge changes. Fast forward a few hundred years, and the Spanish American War began. It started after political tensions over Cuba, and the mysterious explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor saw the US Navy deliver a decisive blow to the Spanish Pacific Fleet at the Battle of Manila Bay in 1898. Spain's defeat and the subsequent Treaty of Paris in December of the same year ended over 3 centuries of harsh Spanish rule. This treaty marked the end of Spanish dominance in the Americas and also handed the Philippines, along with Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam, to the United States. While Spanish rule was mostly exploitive, it also helped create modern infrastructure and introduced Western educational systems. The Galleon Trade, which mainly benefited the colonial elite, helped to connect the Philippines to the global trade network. But what is the true legacy of this period? That's the resilient spirit of resistance and survival that shaped the national identity of the Philippines, a legacy that continues to influence the country today. The American era in the Philippines from 1898 to 1946 was just as explosive as under Spanish rule. Shortly after the Spanish gave up the islands to the United States, the Philippine American War began. This brutal conflict included significant bloodshed and controversy, including the infamous Balangiga Massacre, created by Brigadier General Jacob Hurd Smith. During the war, approximately 20,000 Filipino combatants lost their lives and over 200,000 civilian casualties due to combat, famine, or disease. The Americans too suffered heavy losses, with around 4,300 troops dying, half of them from disease. During this challenging period, the US began to lay down the administrative and infrastructural framework for its new territory. In 1916, the Jones Act promised eventual self-government, a pledge that ended in the creation of Commonwealth status in 1935. This shift was important as it marked a definitive step towards self-rule and full independence. Sadly, things weren't going to be easy for the Philippines, and both the outbreak of World War II and the later Japanese occupation from 1941 to 1945 stopped these plans. This was a time of severe hardship and resistance against Japanese forces, which further heightened the Filipino people's desire for independence. The final end of American colonial rule came with the Treaty of Manila in 1946, which recognized the independence of the Republic of the Philippines. Soon enough, this treaty became a symbol of the nation's long struggle for freedom and self-determination. An archipelago that once consisted of numerous kingdoms was now one united country. In comparison, the American legacy in the Philippines was quite different than that of the Spanish. The United States invested heavily in the archipelago's infrastructure, building roads, bridges, and communication systems that pushed the Philippines into the modern age. They introduced public health initiatives that dramatically improved people's quality of life. Most importantly, they established the American education system in the Philippines, making education more accessible and widespread than the elitist Spanish system. Learning about democratic ideals and systems heavily influenced the Philippine political system, creating the groundwork for future democratic governance. Of course, things weren't easy for the Philippines as it finally became independent, and the nation had some serious challenges to deal with that have continued through the decades. One major issue is that the Philippines have been struggling with poverty. This stretches back to the era of Spanish colonialism, which created a system of inequality. The Encomienda system exploited the population, but also stopped indigenous economic practices. It created a legacy of limited opportunities and stunted economic development. As the nation moved ahead, governmental issues became a serious barrier to progress. Corruption became a normal part of political life, siphoning off resources meant for development and decreasing public trust in the government. Political instability and ineffective policies further worsened the situation, stopping investment and preventing economic growth. Rapid population growth also put immense pressure on the country's resources and infrastructure, stretching them thin. Additionally, the economy's heavy reliance on money from overseas Filipino workers made it quite vulnerable to changes in the market. If things collapse overseas, then the Filipino economy will feel it. Natural disasters regularly destroy the archipelago, with typhoons, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions causing severe damage to the country's infrastructure and agriculture. These disasters are immediate crises, yes, but they're also long-term setbacks to poverty reduction efforts. Millions of people's livelihoods are destroyed. Another big issue is the sheer lack of good infrastructure. This is particularly bad in rural areas where poor transportation, communication, and energy infrastructures stop access to markets and essential services. This limitation is a major roadblock for businesses and affects the overall economic vitality of these regions. To make matters worse, the wealth in the Philippines is very concentrated, with the majority of resources held by a small elite. This unequal distribution of wealth means that while some people's wallets get fatter, a huge portion of the population struggles to meet even their most basic needs. Many Filipinos lack access to quality education, which is an obstacle to better employment opportunities and more economic mobility. According to the 2022 Occupational Wage Survey, the average monthly salary is about 18,423 Filipino pesos, which is approximately $330. Well, of course, it's not all doom and gloom. There are some ways that the Philippines is doing well. One of the biggest economic contributors in the Philippines is the Overseas Filipino Workers, OFWs. This began in the early 1970s through a training program that gave millions of Filipinos the chance to work abroad, primarily in the service industry. Notably, many Filipinos work as domestic helpers, nurses, and F&B staff in countries like Singapore, Saudi Arabia, and Hong Kong. Many of them are very proficient in English, thanks to it being the main language taught in schools, and their hospitality and respectfulness make them very popular service workers. These workers send back home a huge portion of their earnings, contributing between 9 and 10% of the nation's GDP. In 2022 alone, this was approximately 1.97 trillion Filipino pesos, or about $35.2 billion. Tourism is another big part of the Philippine economy. Visitors come to its stunning beaches, like those in Boracay and El Nido, its breathtaking islands such as Cebu, and its world-famous scuba diving spots. The Banu Rice Terraces and the historic city of Vigan are both UNESCO-listed sites that are a huge part of the country's cultural heritage and natural beauty. The business process outsourcing (BPO) industry has seen huge growth and has become a key part of the modern Philippine economy. The sector includes a wide range of services such as customer support, HR, data entry, and accounting, which Filipinos provide to companies around the world. Filipinos are a very valuable part of the workforce worldwide. Manufacturing is also important, with major multinational companies like Intel, TSMC, Pfizer, and Nestle running massive facilities in the country. These companies are attracted by the Philippines' strategic location in Asia, its competitive labor costs, and its highly skilled workforce. They produce everything, including electronics, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and consumer goods. From its centuries under colonial rule to its current status as a nation of vibrant cultures and economies, the Philippines' history has been anything but straightforward. From the scattered chiefdoms and sultanates that were originally part of the archipelago, to the strong national identity created through trials by fire, the Philippines has continuously proven its capacity to rise and rebuild. The Philippines story is one of potential, hope, and anticipation for a future where the resilience of hard work and its people finally pay off in the form of sustained prosperity and improved quality of life for all. As the country moves forward, it carries the legacy of its past, ready to create a path to a brighter and more inclusive tomorrow.